Season 10 has forced upon a brand new meta where the entire game plays quite differently. A lot of characters have shuffled up or down. Today we're going to talk about who's the best characters right now. However, it's a little bit difficult to evaluate currently as we know there's some huge changes coming. In order to sort of future-proof this video for the entirety of Season 10, we have to acknowledge the nerfs that are coming on to Brigitta and the buffs that are coming to Ana. Being able to shoot through teammates as Ana is quite a sleeper buff. If you remember, when D.Va was able to put her defense matrix through teammates, that became a really big deal. Now, obviously, that blocks infinite damage, so of course that's going to be a huge deal. But right now, Ana can't really be played in bulky, tank-heavy compositions where your team is deathballing together. At least not optimally in comparison to the other AoE healers, and once she does get that change, she won't feel so frustrating and useless a lot of the time because big fat Roadhog won't get out of your way so you can heal your Hanzo. I think that's going to make a big impact, and as well as the core of the meta is being assumed to be around Brigitta, I think that's a little bit overblown, but at the same time, she is an incredibly reliable way to play, even if she does have pretty strong counters, because at least on the live version of the game right now, if you play Brigitta comp, you eventually get Rally, and it's so strong that you probably can just W mouse one into the enemy and they have to run away. It feels like a sound barrier that doesn't decay if the entire team has 150 armor coming into a fight, and worse yet, if they time it perfectly so that they get 150 and then they go in and they're getting more armor over time with the end of the Rally. That's really strong, and a big reason why, even when you do start to counter Brigitta, it's really hard to stop them from winning the objective fight with all of that durability. You have to land some incredible ultimates in order to blast through it, but because it's getting nerfed on the PTR, going to cap out at 100, and I've also heard reports from Mangachu on Twitter says that the new Brigitta on PTR feels really bad all of a sudden. I'm not sure if that means a lot of pros and players are really starting to figure out how to hard counter Brigitta comps, or if that extra 50 armor is so significant, as well as the shield, bash, stun, cooldown increase as well. Time will tell. But either way, because Brigitta is very popular, being a brand new hero to ranked, people are going to want to play her, and that sort of sets a meta around her no matter what. The main meta comp that's getting run right now that is the most robust in the most situations is the triple support Rein, Zarya, Lucio, Zen, Brigitta, and probably a Hanzo. Reason being, if they have a team comp that is playing outside of a shield, not deathballing, you can move your Hanzo around, and he probably is going to get a pickoff for you. Hanzo is incredibly reliable at that right now, and whereas a character like Widowmaker feels a little bit flimsy when trying to be a main damage dealer, she really feels a lot more comfortable just going for the pickoffs. Hanzo can kind of switch over between doing both because he can spam so much. And worse yet, he has the mobility and the reliable shots to not be too afraid of Pharah, if you're good enough, of course. But there's also more reasons why those heroes in particular are kind of the meta comp. Reason being, once the enemy has Rally, and they all have all of that HP, one of the only reliable ways to kill most of the team, if not all of them, once they have Rally, is Grab Strike. And to prevent that being done to you, you have Zenyatta in order to negate the effects of such a combo. There are little tricks you can use to exploit this. If you happen to have an Ana or a Mercy, you can damage amp the Hanzo to help it get through Transcendence heals, or of course anti-nade grab in order to do the same. But in general, this is how the standard meta is playing out right now. But I still think there's a ton of sleeper picks and a lot more strategies than that you're going to find success with. And now that we've kind of set the template for what the main meta comp is, we'll break down more individual heroes and where they're resting. I think the first place I want to start is exploiting bad Brigitta players. At a lot of ranks, I think the Brigitta players aren't going to be good enough to avoid some strong DPS play, and specifically we're going to talk about Pharmacy, Junkrat, Doomfist, Mei, and McCree Soldier to a lesser extent. All of these heroes have abilities and cooldowns that can exploit where the Brigitta wants to be fighting, because of course, as we all know, she wants to get in and brawl, but if you're able to find angles to pick her off and catch her over aggressing, well, everything flips on its head. Something that I think you're going to find being most important for Season 10 is the balance between putting resources into focusing the enemy Rein versus trying to get damage into like the Brigitta or the other squishies that they're playing with. Because the problem is the shields are kind of in your way, and if you lose the shields break war, they easily will win over on your tanks. But at the same time, if you're trying to counter the Brigitta rather than mirror it, you probably should be looking to Pharmacy at an off angle to get damage in on the back line. But that's kind of where the balancing act is for me right now. You either want to try to make your team comp be good for shield breaking and have enough firepower to parry back and blow through the shielding so that your damage can finally find something. But if you have too much of a mix of trying to mirror the brawl comp and your damage doesn't equate with what the enemy is running. So like, for instance, if you have slower damage and running something like Pharah Tracer, which used to sound really meta and strong, well, if they run Hanzo and really any other DPS, you're going to find that if the Pharah player isn't straight up focus a squishy and burst it, it's going to be looking really bad. So my suggestion is lean your team comp one way or the other. If you're going for the brawl and your tanks are fighting, and most importantly, the map requires you to contest on the objectives, make sure your comp can do that. But if you're not going for that, Mercy Zen is still really good. Or even solo healing with a Mercy or an Ana, as long as they're safe, of course, and you can keep them alive, with more damage, can open up for other flanky type characters to work. So if you have like a soldier uncontested, he can help you break the shields, and maybe that does make some space for a Doomfist Tracer or whatever flanker that you want to run to zip in and out. But it's really important that you have enough damage, because if you're just trying to brawl head to head and you have like Genji Tracer, you're gonna pretty badly lose the tanking battle and not have the punching power to kill things. And there is sort of like a counterplay meta going on here. So like, if you run Pharmacy Junkrat and the enemy simply can't get moving, they can't get brawling, and they're finding themselves dying before they even get into the brawl, you will force them to swap, but it requires you to have a good map to be able to even run that combination. While we're still talking about DPS, we'll just finish up with some of the other ones that I didn't mention yet. Reaper is probably the most underrated hero right now. I was initially concerned with all the stuns and if he was going to be able to keep up with the brawling of how things are working, because honestly, back in the day, in the multi-tank era, after a few patches, there was a point in time where Reaper felt really weak against multi-tank, but now that he has lifesteal and he can cancel his Wraith form, he really can outplay a lot of the aggression that's coming at him, and you can almost feel like a Tracer used to in the previous meta in terms of like how you can maintain in the fight and keep things at arm's reach. Obviously, you have far less mobility, but you're going to be able to pressure down those tanks and get a ton of shield break done. If you hang in and around by your tanks and pressure the enemy Rhine, there's few things that are going to be able to burst his shield and give you that tanking advantage faster than using a Reaper. And in the same way, Mei is that type of character as well, where the walls can split off the enemy's comp. Whenever that's the case, Mei starts to look good again. She can freeze multiple targets, but mainly it's about that wall. And in the same way, it helps you focus the front line. I think Reaper's a bit more sustainable and doesn't require you hitting a rather difficult CC ability to get his value off, but both can be really good if you're good with them. Is there any DPS that you should look to stay away from? Well, with Rhine shields in the way, Torb is pretty bad. Now, to some degree, you can use him just to add a bit more spam damage into the mix, but I still think you're probably going to want to solo heal with him. Yes, he does add extra armor so that you can be even more tanky, but I'll be looking for the Torb rework to come through before I rate him a bit more highly. The other characters that I haven't mentioned yet, Junkrat, Genji, Widowmaker, Bastion, we'd have to get into more specifics about these on the different maps. I actually think Junkrat feels a little bit worse in this meta than I thought he was going to, especially with how reliable the damage source of a character like Hanzo is, who can just get full-on pickoffs now. And I actually think how unreliable his damage is and how much he charges Zarya, even though typically that's okay, it can be an issue if you don't also have like the Pharmacy or another mobility character that can kind of make use of how much pressure you'll put on the front line. Whereas in the last meta, I kind of felt you could run Junkrat almost all the time, and he was a big threat to all the mobility characters. Right now, I think it matters a lot more that you have the right supplemental DPS to take advantage of the space you make, because it's pretty difficult to carry the game by yourself as Junk with all of the tankiness in your way. It kind of requires you to have a means to an end when playing him, and you might want to just opt for a more reliable, accurate character who can avoid shooting Zarya bubbles like Soldier or Hanzo, or even Pharah, who can jump over the shields altogether. So I think overall she wins out in comparison, except on maps that are really good for Junkrat. As far as tanks go, I see a lot of people picking Orisa, and she'll be good as long as the enemy doesn't go Lucio, because if they go Lucio with Zarya Rhine and play that meta comp I was talking about, they just run you over entirely. The Orisa's gonna have to get on her horse and gallop back and parry away from that aggression, because if you don't control the engagement in that magical Orisa zone where you're breaking their shields before they even get in, it's sort of all or nothing with that. If you're playing her, you better have the shield break and CC and punching power to be able to stop the enemy from getting close to you, because if they do, that Rein, Zarya, Brigitta brawling is just going to overwhelm you and you're not going to have anything to do. Her damage isn't very good against armor at all, which makes her even worse when the rally comes, which is why overall most of the time you're going to want to mirror Reinhardt. Now we've talked a lot about Reinhardt already in previous videos. He's incredibly important, guys. He synergizes with Brigitta and he counters Brigitta. Even though he gets stunned, landing all of his abilities play into that brawling meta, and although it can be incredibly difficult and it requires some teamwork to keep that Rein up, he also is the major focal point to how everything works right now. And if you don't have a Rein, you better have a ton of sick firepower spread across the map. It is possible to win without one, but you're not going to be able to contest the objective. You're going to have to split and avoid the brawl coming through you and land some key damage. Zarya is considered top of the meta as well for graviton, bubbles, and brawling. That seems quite obvious, but I want to really stress and remind everybody that D.Va is still an amazing character. In matchmaking, I still hear people say that Zarya counters D.Va, but that's only if you play D.Va incorrectly. Remember, D.Va isn't a brawler. Instead, you want to use her mobility to make plays, and I'm seeing a lot of cases where the Zarya-Brigitta comp is actually getting countered, especially by Pharmacy, and if that's the case, don't rely on Graviton. You gotta switch to the D.Va in order to take the Pharah out. And also, by the way, especially on defense, you having Grav isn't that valuable because when you're defending, you just want to stay alive. Unless you use Grav in order to trade out some of their ultimates, you're not going to get an economy gain, where it's a lot easier to use Grav at the start of the fight. Well, if the enemy are smart and don't use ultimates, they'll be at an economy advantage going into that. Whereas D.Va is a lot better at trading in these ult fights. She has the possibility to even eat a Grav or a Hanzo arrow or lots of other ult follow-ups. And as well, when the enemy's throwing ults at you, D.Va Bomb can kind of trade and potentially get value and swing a fight back, whereas Graviton oftentimes isn't very good when used in the middle of an ult fight. And as well, there's the other point where contesting high ground is still really important. If the enemy have too much damage on the high ground, all the rally armor in the world doesn't work, especially on some of the biggest maps in the game. In these cases, both D.Va and Winston are going to be key to keep in mind, and even though Winston can get focused really hard in this meta, his reliable damage that goes through barriers is still a great way to initiate into these fights when high ground is involved. If it's not involved, always brawl on the ground with the tanks that we've mentioned already, but once it is, you're going to want to go back to monkey mode. And last, Roadhog is kind of neither here nor there for me. He's okay, not really required to do anything. Sort of like other DPS options right now. If you're sick with him and are able to get value, that's great, but his damage kind of gets muted by armor, and you might want to consider using him in a triple tank, triple support comp, or just in the DPS slot rather than one of your off tanks, because if you run Roadhog, your Rein is going to have a really hard time against the Brigitta, Rein, Zarya that the enemy's probably running. Not only are your hooks probably going to get bubbled, or you don't even find hooks at all, with no bubbles or defense matrix to protect your Rein and help keep him up, it's going to be kind of rough. Obviously, Halt Hook can still be good. Roadhog has great shield break, and that's probably the main time you're going to want to be using him is with Orisa when you're playing to make sure that the enemy has no barriers by the time they reach you in melee range. Then that's going to be key. We already mentioned the supports kind of in passing through this. One character that maybe I should have mentioned during the DPS section is Symmetra, who I honestly think is pretty underrated right now, and if the enemy's running triple support, it might be possible to pressure down the Brigitta by spamming through the barriers. Now, unfortunately, her ult pales in comparison to Brigitta, but if the enemy doesn't want to run Pharah or Winston, it sort of opens a door for Symmetra to have some use once again. Now, it's debatable whether she'll increase in value or decrease once this rework comes in. It sort of depends where they end up and how much power they give her, because right now that teleporter that moves from range sounds like it would help a death ball more than counter one, whereas her weapon currently penetrates through barriers, which is the main reason why I think she stands a chance. Also, projecting a barrier helps you win the shield break war. It can be quite key. And if she kind of transfers that from penetrating barriers to being able to bust barriers with a primary fire, and her ult no longer penetrates them, I'm not exactly sure where that's going to land her, but it's something to keep an eye on. I mentioned her briefly, but Ana can be an absolute hero in the meta right now, and a hero that I think is going to change quite a lot of things once she's more viable with being able to shoot through teammates, because landing an anti-nade is team fight winning. Not only is there counterplay to work with it defensively, potentially surviving in a Graviton with heal amp, but it counters the enemy Zenyatta, and it makes Brigitta look incredibly flimsy once she gets anti-naded. It's pretty hard to land sleep darts with so many shields in the way, but because Winston and D.Va aren't getting played her line of sight in order to heal healer teammates aren't being obstructed nearly as often. I think it's only going to take the buff to come through for her to look really great. But until then, you should focus on using Moira most of the time if you're running a 2-2-2, and also keep her in mind as being one of the most reliable ways to counter pharmacy if the enemy starts to run that. Speaking of Mercy though, I think you're going to want to always run her when you're playing for shield break, not brawl, because it's really important that your damage can find pickoffs, but also because it requires you to play in sort of a split way and probably have your Pharah fly out on an off angle or have a flanker or something. You really need to keep that tempo and man advantage staying, because if you don't and the wrong character dies in the fight, Brigitta on the enemy team often is going to carry it by just standing on the objective, being really tough to die, and having a stun that comes back very frequently. Zenyatta, of course, is really strong all the time. He's another character that can shoot shields, but that's not really why you want to pick him. Discord and Transcendence will help you burst down kills, as well as be the only thing that can save you when the inevitable Graviton Dragon Strike comes. Lucio is not getting enough love, very important, but it does require you, of course, to know how to play with your tanks, and your tanks to know where to go. Speeding in on a good engagement to essentially run past the enemy's front line and maybe just W-mouse 1 onto their support can win the entire fight for free. Sound Barrier looks quite weak in comparison to some of the other support offerings at the moment. However, the crowd control and speed aura is enough to make a very significant win in the frontline battle. Last but not least, Moira is quite good in matchmaking, but not as strong in the meta as you might think. The problem is oftentimes people pick healer combos without a Lucio and then take more damage because their engagements are bad and slow, and then they try to out-heal those bad engagements with Moira. Not a very good idea. Also, with 3 supports often being run in the most optimal comps, you don't really need a ton of healing because you have multiple characters that kind of heal each other and heal themselves. So the powerful healing kind of feels redundant, especially when a lot of the fights are cooldown based, not really a battle of attrition. It's more like they hit a combo of abilities that insta-kill you or an ult stack. Moira isn't really good in those cases. Coalescence doesn't save you from grab strike, and her healing might not be enough anyway if they burst targets effectively. Like you can't out-heal a Hanzo headshot, for example. However, with no divas on the field, your damage orbs can help pressure down some of the squishies and penetrate through barriers. Yet again, that's another important thing to keep in mind. Well, guys, that's everything for the Season 10 Best and Worst Heroes. There's quite a lot to play with, and I think once the Brigitta nerfs come through and it's a bit easier to counter the brawl rather than just mirror it, we're going to see a lot more interesting rock, paper, scissors going on. It already is the case quite strongly if their comp is built to do the job better and plays either to brawl better or to anti-brawl better. That team basically wins. It's sort of just like whoever's running full dive or counter dive appropriately. And overall, it's easier to run the brawl comp, but I don't necessarily think it's more effective. I think if you run Pharmacy Junkrat, it can really make the front line struggle and force them to change things up. And of course, every map plays different, and you're going to want to remember to play the map, not the meta. On the close range maps, play the meta. But other than that, you can really exploit high ground and the size of maps to get other characters to work quite well as well. If you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe because we upload each and every day. So you're gonna want to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been FREEDO for Your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.